going to wait another minute or two for some more people to join. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the July installment of ILA's Leadership Perspective webinar series. I am Ted Thomas. I'm the Director for the Department of Command and Leadership at Command and General Staff College. And I will be moderating this webinar with Colonel Tom Kolditz, who's the Professor and Head of the Department of Behavioral Sciences and Leadership at the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York. Before we start, please note the following. First, this webinar will be archived. If you missed something, would like to hear the webinar again, or would like to see the presentation again, they will be published to the ILA website within 24 hours. You will receive an email with instructions for accessing the archived recording after the webinar has ended. Second, we welcome your questions throughout the webinar. At any time, you may ask questions by typing them into the questions box of your webinar control panel, which is currently displayed on the right-hand side of your screen. We will pause to address some of these questions throughout the webinar. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Colonel Thomas Kolditz is Professor and Head of the Department of Behavioral Sciences and Leadership at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Colonel Kolditz has served in an array of military tactical command and technical staff assignments worldwide and is a leadership and HR policy analyst at the Pentagon. He is also the officer in charge of the West Point parachute team. He's done research on Extremist Leadership, which is leadership at the point of death, where followers perceive their lives to be threatened. And he has shown that the leadership lessons and principles and evidence in dangerous settings also apply to leading in business and everyday life. And he's well acquainted with Extremist Leadership with his work with the Cadets on the parachute team, whose many of those leaders he's mentored. And without further ado, I'll turn the time over to Colonel Thomas Kolditz.
Well, thanks so much for that introduction, Ted. I appreciate it very much. What I'd like to do today is to just talk briefly, maybe 15 or 20 minutes, about in extremis leadership and the approach that we've been taking in understanding crisis leadership dynamics, and then perhaps it'd be an opportunity to ask questions and so forth. So the first thing I'd like to do is thank the ILA for having me here. It's very kind, and also to draw the viewers' attention to the disclaimer at the bottom of my first slide that I am here as an individual author, and what I say doesn't reflect any official position of the Military Academy, the Army, or the Department of Defense. Just goals for the session here. I work crisis leadership in a conceptual context. There's really two ways of approaching the study of crisis leadership. One way is to study business case studies, and there are many of them out there, good ones that you can study and learn about crisis leadership. But what you usually see in these studies is a story about relatively ordinary people who were overtaken by a crisis and then somehow clawed their way out or got things to work again. A second way, and I think a more effective way of looking at crisis leadership, is by studying people who are in dangerous contexts all the time. People who routinely work in dangerous contexts are virtually at a crisis footing all the time, and so the leadership styles and approaches that they develop there seem to have a lot of applicability in crisis contexts. But the second bullet there, evidence-based, is an important one. At West Point, we don't do any leadership instruction that doesn't have an evidentiary basis to it. So we focus on existing research, and we do some of our own research to make sure that we're getting it right. And in this case, since we're focused on leading in dangerous contexts, we wanted to get it exactly right. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about research that we've done and the outcomes of that research as we walk through this session. So you can ask yourself, and you should see a slide now that says experience assessment. Is that up, Ted?
Yes, it's up. Thanks.
Okay, great. Well, you see this experience assessment, and you can ask yourself, have you ever been shot at before? Do you participate in an extreme sport? Do you have military, police, or firefighting experience? Have you experienced a life-threatening crisis or death in your organization? And then the tough one down there at the bottom, responsible or accountable for the death of another person. And what I find when I talk to people really around the globe is that everybody comes down on this assessment as having some of this experience. And our cadets will certainly say yes to most, if not all, of these questions within 18 months of graduation. So it makes this an important topic, and it also draws just about everyone into this sphere. So why even talk about this with people who are not military or police or firefighters or extreme sport people? Well, there are a number of reasons. First of all, leadership in dangerous contexts hinges on trust. And trust is an important commodity in all kinds of business leadership. In most business enterprises, businesses being more conscious of a moral imperative to what they do, whether it's client relations or actions that they take to maintain their business. And it's the same thing in dangerous contexts. Leaders who take people into dangerous places don't have the right to get it wrong. And so there's a moral obligation to focus on this and to get it right. And just highlighting number 6 down there, most of us grossly underestimate our proximity to crisis. I mean, one of the characteristics of crisis is that it's unexpected. And so most of the time we don't think that we're going to have a tragedy in our family or a business crisis at work or any of the other things that people are drawn into where they have to think like a crisis leader. So it's worthwhile to talk to anyone about this particular topic because we all use it sooner or later. It's not a matter of whether we'll be in a crisis. It's much more a matter of when and what the nature of the crisis might be. In terms of social responsibility towards people who do live and work in dangerous contexts, you can see that it's a large number of people. It's 4 million people in the United States, more than 30 million worldwide, and the people that those public servants are serving are us. So almost 300 million people in the United States are served by these individuals, and so it's a worthwhile group of people to study, and they are understudied, in my opinion. It's much more exciting to study pinnacle business leaders, and there's more money in business leadership, but these folks really do lead under some of the most difficult circumstances imaginable, and we can learn a lot from them. And that's what I've been spending the last 6 or 7 years doing. I've also been frustrated with the existing research when I've tried to apply it to dangerous contexts. And the slide that you see there is a simple slide that basically describes the scientific method. It shows concepts on the left. You cross over into the empirical realm through definition, manipulation, and observation. And then you have an experiment or an interview or what have you, and you keep repetitively correcting your theories. But when you change the context under which the evidence is gathered, you can no longer accept those findings without replicating and extending the experiments or observations into the new context. And academia doesn't do that very much. Most of us who do research in academia are challenged to get through the institutional review processes just to do ordinary experiments, much less take someone out of an airplane with a laptop strapped to their chest. So it's a challenge, and it's one that we work on every day, but we do not accept leadership research that's been done in other contexts or with other focus, and then just try to apply it willy-nilly in the crisis context. So in order to move this forward and to have a science around this, we had to start with a definition, and I chose that term in extremis in part because it was already a Department of Defense term. It meant, you know, a situation where there was imminent loss of life, and so in extremist leadership just takes the Army's leadership definition, purpose, motivation, and direction, and it adds this concept of imminent danger, and where followers believe that leader behavior will influence their physical well-being or survival. So it's all about beliefs, and beliefs are measurable. And it's about followers and what they believe. So we started with that as a definition and moved forward with some research that I'd like to talk to you about briefly to develop a framework for leading in dangerous and crisis contexts. So I started out in 2003 going to Iraq with 3 other individuals, a retired Army lieutenant colonel who was an IO psychologist, an Arabic linguist, and an infantry officer that was also interested in research. And we went really the length of the country. We started out just north of Kuwait, interviewing Iraqi prisoners at a place called Qasr, Iraq, and flew north to this photograph that you see is a place called Hilla. It's just south of Baghdad. The ruins that you see at the base of that palace are the ruins of ancient Babylon. And it's where the 1st Marine Division paused on the march to Baghdad. And I interviewed 16 Marines in that palace over a 2-day period. Flew from there to Baghdad International Airport and used the airport like the hub of a wheel, and went out on the spokes every day for 2.5 weeks and interviewed 54 soldiers from the 3rd Infantry Division, 101st Airborne Division, and all of these soldiers and Marines had experienced very heavy fighting in the week prior. Baghdad, we had just closed on Baghdad. All of them had lost people. None of them had had really hot food or showers or mail in the 30 days prior. So it was very difficult conditions, and the leadership that they had in combat was about as fresh in its mind as a researcher is going to be able to gather. We did a second study focused on cadets here, and it was a comparative study where we looked at 10 team sport captains, football, softball, and so forth, 10 individual sport captains like swimming, diving, wrestling, and then we interviewed 10 of the instructor leaders, the seniors, on the cadet parachute team. They were very experienced parachutists, more than 500 jumps each. All of them had competed nationally. All of them had instructor ratings and were actively involved in instructing and leading the more junior cadets on the team. And then the last study I did was a typical interview study where I brought in anyone that I thought clearly fit this definition of an in extremis leader. So, and most of them were not in the military. I interviewed large formation skydiving organizers, people that put 300 or 400 people out of an airplane at the same time. I interviewed a woman who takes HD video teams into the Indian tiger preserves and videotapes tigers on the ground. I interviewed the SWAT team chiefs from the San Francisco and New York offices of the FBI. I interviewed 3 climbing guides who take people up Everest and K2 and other dangerous climbs. And the only thing that all these people had in common was that they routinely led people in dangerous contexts, not exceptionally, but routinely. And they had all lost someone along the way. Somebody had gotten killed with them while they were doing what it is that they do. So from there, we were able to take all of the tapes from the interviews and the questionnaire material, and we did a content analysis. And for those that aren't sociologists, a content analysis is a way of reducing textual material to themes in an objective way. So you have coders who go through and code what they're reading for major themes, and they're unaware of their hypotheses when we do it. So having done that, we were able to derive a framework for how leading in dangerous contexts was unique or different than leading in more ordinary contexts. And you see that framework on the left side of the slide. And the first thing we found that competence and loyalty and trust were important. And that sounds very obvious. I mean, you're all interested in leadership, so you know you would find those things to be important in any kind of leadership research or endeavor. But what was different here is the preeminence of competence as a leader quality. We looked at 10 variables. The difference between competence and the second variable was as great as the difference between the second variable and the 10th variable. I mean, it was a whopping difference. And the other thing that we found is that you had to start with competence, and then there had to be a caring component that the soldiers referred to as loyalty, and it was loyalty down the chain. So the two things that people in dangerous contexts are worried about is my leader good enough to get us through this? And secondly, are his motivations towards me honorable enough that I'm not going to get thrown under the bus? And when those two things are achieved in a crisis context, trust begins to build. And without those two things, it's almost impossible to build trust. And so with those two things present, trust becomes pervasive in these environments, and it's really what you're looking for in a crisis. And I like this. There's a New York Times article about a year ago where President Bush was going after offshore holdings. And people were somewhat puzzled because as a matter of national economic policy, it wasn't going to generate sufficient revenue to fix anything in the crisis. But it became clear that what he was really looking to generate was trust by taking action and demonstrating some degree of economic competence focused on these offshore holdings. So the second thing we found has to do with the way that people need to be motivated in crisis contexts versus more routine times. When we asked the team captains to rank order 9 leadership competencies that would be reflective of their personal strengths, the number one competency, far and away, for those sports team captains was motivating. But when we looked at the data from the parachute team, motivating for them was second from the bottom of a list of 9. It was not even on their scope. And so as we dug into the interview data, what we found is that crisis and dangerous contexts are inherently motivating. People are already upset, and they need a leader that is much more calm and quiet rather than a cheerleader type or a somebody that's going to chew them out. And Hollywood absolutely does us no favors here. Movie directors need to excite the audience. So anytime there's a crisis, they have to have a leader in the crisis that's stirring things up. And often we see leaders that are very animated and screaming into radios and things like that. And in reality, it's just the opposite that's required to lead people in dangerous places. And I always, when I'm talking about this, I like to use the slide that shows a large group of skydivers. That's 357 skydivers over Phuket, Thailand. And at the time that they did this jump, it was a world record. And if you look carefully at the photo, you'll see a little green speck in the middle of it. That is the leader. That's the person who planned and organized all of these individuals from all around the world to accomplish this incredibly complex and difficult jump. And he signals the end of the jump, or nearing the end of the jump, by opening his parachute, and then all 356 other people have to find room for theirs to open. So it's a very dangerous enterprise. And his focus is not on motivation at all. He told me that he didn't even know how to respond to questions about motivating because he just doesn't do it. People bring motivation to a dangerous context. So if among the parachutists motivating was not their number one competency, what was? Well, it was learning. And when we dug into that, we found that it was not only a learning orientation, but it is an outward focus on the environment. So when leaders are in crisis routinely, they learn how to focus on the environment, focus outward. And that does two things that are very, very important. The first thing it does is it almost eliminates the ability to feel emotion or to become emotional. And the reason for that, you see a brain depicted on that slide. Our fear center is the amygdala, and that's where the flight or fight reflex comes from. And when that center is activated, that's what we feel. Well, when we focus outward or we focus on tasks that we've been trained at, the prefrontal cortex becomes activated. That's in the forebrain. That's in the front of the brain, more towards the forehead. And as that happens, activation of the amygdala goes down rapidly, and so the individual is better able to deal with threat and less likely to become emotional. And it's not a subtle effect at all. If you look at the two EEG traces that are above that brain, the one on the left is a pistol shooter firing at a target and practicing. The one on the right is the same pistol shooter firing on the same target but competing. And so we can see a difference in brainwave activity, significant difference, just based on the difference in focus between practice and competition. So it's very powerful. And not only is it powerful in an evolutionary sense that it prevents threat from overcoming the individual, either in the form of emotion or external threat, but it also creates the conditions for very rapid learning. I was approached by the parents of a young man about 2 years ago who said that for his 18th birthday he wanted nothing more to do than make a parachute jump, but that he couldn't go to a commercial center because he had autism and he had Asperger's. And so you can see our jump depicted there. I spent about 2 hours with a psychologist and a special education teacher that specialized in autism, learning how this young man would learn. And then I spent 2.5 hours with the young man and trained him up on something that would probably take me 20 minutes to teach anyone else. And what I was able to discover and what I used to my advantage was this notion of threat. And so I explained to him that we had to do this right, or it put both of us at risk. And he responded very well to that and did as well coming out of the airplane as anybody that I've ever taken. And it was important because he was about 8 inches taller than me and had about 40 pounds on me. But he was able to learn, and I think it was a lot of it was because of the outward focus that he was able to develop and the task focus. So just a powerful anecdotal experience for me personally in how dangerous contexts create these conditions for learning that otherwise probably wouldn't have occurred. The fourth characteristic of leading in dangerous contexts is one we refer to as shared risk, and it's ubiquitous in the military. You always hear about people sharing risk with others. However, it tends to not be valued as much in business. You know, you'll find people with golden parachutes where they're running a business where they have virtually no personal risk compared to the people who they are wanting to lead. And that's okay when there's not a crisis. No one cares about it unless things go bad. But as soon as things go bad, the trust factor begins to erode in that organization. So the degree to which business people can demonstrate to others that they're all in will often determine the degree to which they are trusted by the people working for them in crisis. And it can mean a difference between whether those employees stick around or whether they begin to bail at an inopportune time. And I like to use this photo of a parachute team coach. This happens to be me, but it could be any of our coaches. We always coach from outside the aircraft. And that's done for two reasons. First is that the exit from the aircraft is very critical. It only lasts for about 2 seconds, and if it's not done right, it can influence the rest of the skydive for the people doing it. But also what we found is that novices their confidence is tremendously bolstered when they see someone climb outside the aircraft. It's difficult to climb back in once you're out there, so the skydive has really begun once you're out there, and they will always exit when somebody's out there. They have much less confidence if the instructor's in the aircraft saying, "Go ahead, I'm right behind you." The last part of our framework is something similar to that, but since it came out separate in the content analysis, we named it separately. And it's something that we refer to as common lifestyle. And essentially what happens is that in crisis, people look to see what the leader values insofar as it is reflected in their lifestyle. And so in the military, leaders are very conscious of never advantaging themselves. They wear the same clothing. In this photograph, you'll see leaders from brigadier general down to private, and you can't tell who's who. On the other hand, business leaders often will accept perks and do other things to set themselves apart from other people. And much like the shared risk concept, it's not a big deal in circumstances where people are not worried or afraid. But as soon as they become concerned about their future or the future of their organization, then people focus much more on, you know, the lifestyle of the leader and what is their relationship to them. And it's a great time for leaders to reduce their social distance, whether it's you know, showing up at a funeral where you're not really expected because there was a great deal of social distance there to begin with, or being in the room at 2 o'clock in the morning when everybody's working hard and not really expecting the boss to show up. So that was essentially the framework that we derived, and we use it in various ways. We teach this framework in the core leadership course at West Point. The book's been adopted by the Israeli Defense Forces, by the Japanese National Defense Academy. But, you know, I really don't view this as a purely military thing or a public servant kind of thing. Most of these leadership lessons also ring true in more ordinary leadership settings. So you know, the things that we learn from people who lead routinely in dangerous contexts work pretty well in non-dangerous contexts. What is not true is that things that work in calm and safe environments don't always work in dangerous environments. So just a couple of the takeaways. Motivation can cut both ways. Motivation and motivating people is very complex. And if you cheerlead at a time when you should really be quiet and be more introspective and calm, it's going to alienate you from people. This learning orientation and this outward orientation is how you keep the team on the task and how you keep people's emotions in check. But you have to watch peripherally, because in crisis, people will focus on what they think the problem is, and they will forget other more routine things that can eventually turn into problems if they're left unattended. So focusing on task orientation of your people and how they're responding to the crisis is extremely important. And then trying not to set yourself apart from people, particularly in crisis. There is an unfortunate tendency for leaders to want to centralize everything in a crisis in order to exert control. And they also tend to distance themselves from their people because they don't want to be caught saying the wrong thing, being overheard saying the wrong thing, and so forth. And that is exactly the wrong thing to do. The right thing to do in a crisis context is to reduce your social distance, get closer to people, don't set your influence apart from them at that particular point in time. And with that, that was a very quick run through of, you know, the way that we view leadership in dangerous contexts and crisis leadership, why we think about it the way we do, and why we're fascinated about the topic, about learning about it and about teaching it to other people. And I think I'm ready to ask or answer any kind of questions that.
Yeah, I've got several questions for you, Tom. First question is there a specific historical or political event which you think we can see in a different way when put under the lens of in extremis leadership?
You know, I don't know about an historical event. I mean, if you look at some of the grand historical crises, they've been pretty well sliced and diced. The one that immediately pops to mind is Rudy Giuliani during 9/11. But if you take that framework and you overlay it on what Giuliani communicated, how he behaved, where he positioned himself physically, it's classic in extremis leadership. During Katrina, the Chief of Staff of the Army was with the President of the United States and used the term in extremis setting for what was going on during Katrina. And if you look at the way that the successful leaders there operated, and I'll give you two examples. The first would be the classic Russell Honore taking over command and control of operations in Katrina. You see the same pattern in his actions just in spades, particularly this notion of common lifestyle. General Honore communicated with people in Louisiana as a Louisiana native, was very, very close to the people that he was protecting and trying to lead. But another great example would be the evacuation of Tulane Hospital during Katrina, which was overseen by a CEO from Nashville, from Hospital Corporations of America, HCI, named Jack Bovender. And Bovender immediately began communicating by email. It was the only way that he could communicate with people in the hospital, and made it clear that operations were decentralized, that they needed to act in accordance with their values, and he supported them 100% on the decisions that they made, and the evacuation of that hospital was very well done. It was considered a shining star in pandemonium there during Katrina. And when I probed Bovender, I asked him, you know, how was it that you were able to come on to these communication styles and this way of communicating to people that empowered them and made them feel confident and allowed you to lead in crisis when all you had was email? And he said, well, you know, I couldn't become in 30 minutes what I hadn't been in 30 years. And that was one of the first points where I felt that it was important that we look at in extremis leadership as really a way that you lead every day, that you think in terms of these kinds of things every day, because you don't really have an opportunity to change yourself in a crisis.
Good point. Kolditz from the UK asked a question. He said, while experiencing extreme perceived and or actual stresses, strategic leaders' physiological, psychological, or neurological or other factors have a critical impact on leadership vision, for example, of tunnel vision. What strategies, tactics, tools, or techniques do you recommend for countering tunnel vision in critical strategic leadership contexts so that the right thing is decided or done during strategic crises?
Well, the basic principle there is to first, don't go it alone. When you're in a strategic setting, there are a lot of people involved in decision support, and so consequently it's important to not allow a staff, a strategic planning staff, or others to begin to develop sort of a collective tunnel vision or a groupthink. And there are a couple ways of avoiding that. One that the military uses extensively is something called red teaming, where people will be appointed to have no role in planning except for criticizing the plan and thinking like a competitive, a thinking competitor, and trying to pick the plan apart. I think that either done by a planning team or just by a single trusted agent, you know, a leader pulling a chief of staff over or someone else and saying, can you criticize what we're doing here? Can you tell us, you know, why we're missing the big picture or why we're developing tunnel vision or groupthink? You know, can be very helpful. The other thing to remember is that people do not stay focused in a crisis 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Even in active combat, people are going to catch some sleep. They're going to catch 3 hours. And so this task focus that we're so good at in the midst of the crisis will be temporarily suspended. You know, think of it in terms of employees that are in a business that's in crisis, driving home about midnight, and then getting up at 6 in the morning and driving back in to re-engage on the crisis. As that happens, when people lose that task focus, they're going to turn inward instead of outward, and they're going to begin to experience those emotions. And that pulse of activity where you're focused and then you have downtime is really important to manage. And combat leaders manage it, and good leaders in business crises also make sure that their people get a little bit of downtime. You know, even half an hour of pulling people off the line a little bit, joking with them about the circumstances, and then getting back after it does wonders for people's mental health and mental agility. And so pulsing in and out of that is also very important.
Got another question. Is how do leaders balance decentralized control or confidence in their people from centralized control when everyone is looking to the leader for guidance and example?
Well, I think leaders need to remember that you can delegate authority, but you can't really delegate responsibility. So it's important to communicate to people as you're doing that that you're still responsible, but you need them to take action. And that was really the Jack Bovender story during Katrina. I mean, he was he had empowered people to do just about whatever they needed to do on behalf of patients. And so his expressing that intent clearly empowered people to delegate and to have people at very low levels taking action. Most of us as leaders, if we study ourselves a little bit, if we think about the way we operate, we have a tendency to either delegate too much or to delegate not enough. Personally, I don't delegate enough. I catch myself trying to do too much. And just having that meta-awareness of my own vulnerability is something that helps me be much more deliberate about delegating in dangerous or crisis contexts. The other thing is, because of the ambiguity that characterizes crisis, people that are in a lot of crises, or they live and work in dangerous contexts, which are also ambiguous, they really do have to delegate. It's just the only way to cover all your bases and to survive. And so getting some practice at that, I think, helps people to be better at it when they really truly need to delegate in a fast-moving crisis where there's lots of uncertainty and ambiguity and no way to centralize decision-making in an effective manner.
I've got another question that may be difficult to answer, or difficult to research at least, but have you gained any insights about situations in which death is viewed as imminent and unavoidable? In other words, that people have already resigned themselves to dying?
You know, I haven't done any research in that. I've read some stories and some accounts. There are some mountain climbing accounts that include individuals who knew that they weren't going to make it off the mountain and could talk about that to other people. And there's also actually a fairly rich literature about people who are terminally ill. But I haven't wrapped any of that back into into our work on leading in dangerous contexts. The only way that we've addressed that is to teach people, and I think I wrote about it a little bit in the book, that what you learn to do in these contexts is to never, ever, ever give up. Never resign yourself to the fact that you have a problem that's not going to be resolved. And maybe it's my parachuting background. I mean, I can remember instructors teaching me from, even in the late 70s and early 80s, all the way to the present. I have a mentor who's a great tandem instructor who taught me how to take people on my chest. And just part of the whole worldview and value system is that if you have a problem, you never, ever stop trying to fix it until it just takes over. So I just haven't looked at that, but it would be interesting, I think, to do that. And there are certainly opportunities to get information like that.
You've used the terms crisis leadership and extremist leadership in a similar manner. Can you differentiate between the two?
Well, I mean, crisis leadership is much broader. And what's a crisis to one person is not necessarily a crisis to another. We use the term in extremist leadership specifically to refer to circumstances where followers believe that leader behavior is going to influence their physical well-being or survival. As if this leader doesn't do his or her job right, we're going to get shot, or we're going to freeze to death, or we're going to have a physical problem. And the reason that I started with that definition is that there's a fairly interesting line of research in an area called terror management theory, TMT, that focuses on a concept called mortality salience. And what mortality salience is a circumstance where you bring an individual's own mortality into their consciousness. So what the researchers will do is they will have people imagine and write about the circumstances of their own death as they envision it. And what the researchers found was that this influences the way that followers look at leaders and interpret leader communications. And they found an increased preference for charismatic leadership among followers who had enhanced mortality salience. You know, multiple studies done by Solomon and Brzezinski and others. And that was really the first point at which I knew there was good, solid empirical evidence that threat of death changes what followers need in leaders. So the in extremis concept goes into that level of detail. You know, what a crisis is, or what crisis leadership is just much broader. It's just kind of the term that's used in business or broadly about people leading under circumstances that they wish they didn't have to lead under.
Thanks. I appreciate that. Do you have any thoughts on leaders creating dangerous situations or creating the perception of a dangerous situation in order to leverage more control? And do you have any examples of that in recent history which you feel might be especially poignant?
Well, you know, in the research that was done that I just described using mortality salience, one of the studies that they did was on messages, communications made by presidential candidates. And in particular, they were focused on George Bush and John Kerry. And Bush's messages were highly charismatic, and they included subtle threats of death. I mean, you know, there was a message, one communication he became relatively well known for, where he said, "Don't let the smoking gun be a mushroom cloud." And he had focused the country on 9/11 and the threat of terrorism and so on and so forth. John Kerry's messages were much more rational. They were much more argumentatively based. And you know, we all know how the election went, and they were able to demonstrate empirically with subjects that those kinds of references increase people's susceptibility to charismatic and visionary messages, which were very characteristic of Bush's campaign. So that would probably be the best known example of that I could come up with.
Thanks. Do you know of any research or insight on the long-term impact of in extremis situations, or that is after the threatening situation is passed, how the followers view the leader and how the leader in those in extremis positions may be affected by long-term exposure to it?
No, but you know, that's a great question, and we really ought to get after that, because we have so many units that have rotated back from Iraq or Afghanistan where it would be relatively easy to tap back into them. And I've had at one time or another 9 different people working on just this notion of how is leadership different in those circumstances, including one who was unfortunately wounded in Iraq, very lightly, thank goodness, and he's gone on to bigger and better things, and he's headed back here to be a permanent professor in my department. But this notion that, you know, having gone through these pinnacle experiences will then change the way followers view leaders is an important one. The only part of that I think we know a little bit about now has to do with the perception that when people are under pressure, that what you then see is an accurate reflection of their character. And that came out in some trust research done by my colleague Pat Sweeney in Iraq, where leaders who lost control in a dangerous context, you know, became angry, became emotionally frustrated and animated, did real damage to their ability to lead their subordinates, either in future dangerous contexts or in contexts that were not dangerous moving forward. So I think people have intuitively determined that what they see coming from a leader in a crisis or a dangerous context is authentic and is a good reflection of what they're going to see in that leader or what they can expect from that leader later on. And if it's good, then I think that's very good for the leader. And if it's not good, there's a certain amount of permanence to that, and it's a problem that has to be overcome only over time.
Did you notice any difference in your analysis of data by leaders in a combatant versus a non-combatant context?
Well, no, as a matter of fact. I mean, the information that we got from the extreme sport coaches, climbing guides, and so forth was very, complementary. I mean, it was virtually the same pattern, same styles were emerging, and there really was no difference. In the 24 people that I interviewed in the third study, only 2 of them were military people, and all the rest were not. Of course, the Iraq study, virtually everyone was military, and unfortunately, virtually everyone was male. I didn't get any women into the sample until we came back and started working with the parachute team and with the others. But the reason I think that we didn't find much difference is that conceptually threat is threat, and some threats are scarier than others. I mean, but people are still wanting to see the sun come up the next day. And being afraid because you're in a very difficult climbing situation, or being afraid because there's an active competitive threat is still a threat to your perceived future. It's still a threat to life. And conceptually, I don't find much difference in those. I mean, as an individual, I see them as different. I just don't have any evidence that they're different, that there's a different kind of fear, or that there's a different kind of mortality salience that's caused by combat versus non-combat life threats.
Thanks.
Sure.
We've got time for about one more question. It's just a general question. I'd like to ask, why don't more behavioral scientists study leadership and human behavior in dangerous contexts? I mean, it's a fascinating thing and affects so many of us. I'm curious why there's not more people out there doing it.
Well, the simple answer is because it's a pain in the neck to go to places like Iraq or into dangerous contexts where you can get really solid data. But the good news is they have begun. Last month there was a special issue of Military Psychology magazine, which is the journal that's put out by the Society for Military Psychologists, that was entirely devoted to articles on leading in dangerous contexts. And there's been a renewed interest among psychologists who study leadership in extreme contexts. We've studied leadership in deserts and adverse environments for a long time. They have now started to turn towards physical threat as an area of interest. So I think what you're going to see going forward, and honestly it gives me a lot of satisfaction, are more and more researchers realizing that there's a distinction between an extreme environment and a dangerous context. And so they're starting to do research to separate the two, and I think you're going to see more and more quality publications about that in the future.
Tom, I want to just thank you for being here and sharing with us your thoughts on extremist leadership. I think there's very, very good things for us to learn as leaders, as practitioners, as teachers of leadership that we can gain from this. I'd like you to give a little bit of plug for your book, if you would. Like I said, we're short on time. But please give a quick plug on your book, and then I'll remind everybody that in August our next Leadership Perspectives webinar series is with Warren Bennis, and he'll be covering his soon-to-be-published book, Still Surprised. Tom?
Well, Thanks, Ted. The book's called Extremist Leadership, Leading as If Your Life Depended on It, and you can get it at Amazon.com or wherever you want to go for it. It's a book that I originally wrote because I thought it would be useful in courses here at West Point, but it's actually gotten around a lot more than I thought it would. It's out in Japanese now. It comes out in Chinese next month. The Israeli Defense Force has been very interested in it. A researcher there, Uzi Ben-Ari, has used it in his teaching and in their ground tactical command course. And so I think it's a book that most people will enjoy reading. It's written so that people can get some insights into dangerous places where most people don't ordinarily get to go. And I'd also like to tell you that I don't take any personal royalties for that book at all. I've deferred all the royalties to the Leader to Leader Institute in New York and the West Point Association of Graduates. I consider this study of leadership in dangerous contexts to be not just important, but kind of a moral obligation. If people at places like West Point don't study it, then no one else will. And so I wanted to make it very easy for people to get this information. So that's about the book.
Thanks, Tom, and thank you all for joining us today. I appreciate your time and attendance. Thank you very much.